Good morning and welcome to Trevor Phillips on Sunday. It's been the sort of week when things in politics have been turned on their head. First, Chesham and Amersham turned from blue to orange as the Lib Dems pulled off a big by-election shock. And this morning, John Bercow announces that he's trading Conservative blue for Labour red. The latter news is admittedly less of a shock, but the surprise by-election defeat is enough to leave Boris Johnson feeling pretty blue himself, especially as he also tackles rising cases of the Delta variant, rebellion over his planning reforms, and a perilous situation with the Orangemen in Northern Ireland. Well, with all those stories and more, we've got plenty to discuss with our guests today. In just a moment, the Justice Secretary Robert Buckland will be joining us. We'll be joined by John Bercow for his first TV interview since announcing his defection to Labour. I'll be asking Sir Ed Davey if this week's by-election victory is a one-off or the start of a Lib Dem surge. Shadow Housing Secretary Steve Reid will be on the show, and we'll be talking to the former chair of the Social Mobility Commission, Alan Milburn, about catch-up in schools and what it means for levelling up. But first, let's go to Westminster, where we're joined by the Justice Secretary Robert Buckland. Mr. Buckland, let's start with COVID. The Airline Pilots Union this morning is saying that their industry is being devastated and it's time to lift some of the travel restrictions, perhaps a vaccine passport. Can you offer them any hope?
Well, I think the system we devised, Trevor, was designed to give the highest degree of hope, consistent with the need to contain and control the virus. I think that inevitably, in a situation as unprecedented and demanding as this, there are going to have to be significant trade-offs, and it's clear that holidays as normal or travel as normal was never going to be the case, bearing in mind the rise of particular variants, most notably the Delta variant. I think throughout this crisis, we've tried to strike the right balance between the natural need in some cases for international travel, but also the imperative of making sure that we do everything we can at home to contain and prevent inadvertent spread of new variants of concern. This is a hugely difficult situation. I think of omelettes and eggs, I'm afraid, but we are doing our very best to maintain that balance with regular reviews of the regulations to allow the maximum flexibility.
But it is time to at least offer them something. There must be some possibility of a move, surely.
Well, of course, regularly my colleagues in the Department for Transport are working on reviewing the mechanism and indeed applying the tests that we apply to the red, amber, green system, and changes are made, sometimes changes in a direction that will help travel, sometimes regrettably changes in the other direction. That's continuing work. We're not standing still on these matters, and that will continue guided by the evidence that we have.
OK, these are decisions for ministers. The Telegraph this morning claims that Matt Hancock withheld information from the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and from Michael Gove about just how successful the vaccination programme had been. And that suggests that had the Prime Minister known about that data, then perhaps lockdown would have been lifted earlier. Is there any truth in that?
Sadly, I'm afraid that report is wrong. The data that was provided... Nonsense. The data was provided to the Prime Minister and other members of that Cabinet Committee in the most up-to-date way before the decision was made on Monday. Those taking part in the meeting had all the relevant data in the most up-to-date way before the decision was made. There's no question of the Prime Minister not being cited on important data. It was provided to him and other members of that committee in the normal way, as people would expect.
OK, well, that's clear. Can I just ask a personal question here? My daughter told me this week that she is going to get married. Is there any possibility that if she opts for an open-air wedding, that actually she'll be able to have more than 30 guests?
Well, indeed, the reforms that I announced today relate to the flexibility within existing approved premises to have the wedding ceremony out of doors. And that does create greater flexibility for premises in order to have more guests in a safe way. Having a wedding outdoors, it will be a civil wedding. It can't be a religious or a Church of England wedding, but a civil wedding or civil partnership ceremony, being able to take place out of doors as opposed to inside the premises, will indeed allow for that greater flexibility. Obviously, each premises will have its own guidance and its own rules, but it just allows couples that to be more imaginative about the way in which they can accommodate friends and loved ones to what is the most special day in their lives.
Great. So that means that our family, of which there are many hundreds, will all be able to turn up. So thank you. Let's go to politics now. You went down to a huge defeat in Chesham and Amersham. Not you personally, but your party. Some 12,000 voters moved from blue to orange on Thursday, many because they say that the Tories have forgotten their traditional southern supporters in their mad pursuit of the northern red wall. Now, is that OK with you? Is that a price you're prepared to pay?
Well, first of all, I don't accept that choice. You know, the idea that somehow voters in the north or voters in the south are an entirely different species is frankly patronising and wrong. I went out on the doors in Chesham and Amersham and listened very hard to the concerns that were being raised by residents about local issues, HS2, development, those sort of important points being raised. And clearly, the message has been conveyed very strongly in the form of that by-election result. But I think, you know, it's wrong to say that somehow the party has to make a choice between people and that, you know, somehow people in the south are, you know, driven by, I think somebody said they were more sophisticated. I mean, what absolute rubbish. You know, people are people, and local issues on planning and development exist all over the country. Clearly, a message was sent. It's a strong message. It's one that we are listening to very carefully and considering carefully. We want to succeed in all parts of our country. And I can tell you, certainly from my point of view, I've never taken voters for granted. And I know that the MPs I work with and party campaigners never take anything for granted, as this by-election clearly shows.
To be clear, nobody here at Sky thinks that voters in the south are more sophisticated than voters in the north. But you talked about the message that you heard from Chesham and Amersham. Are you going to listen and change the proposals on planning that would make it easier for developers to build and harder for objectors to stop development?
Well, of course, those proposals are being developed, and I think it's right to clear up some myths about this. You know, the suggestion that somehow the Chilterns were going to be bricked over and built over is a nonsense, because the Chilterns is an area of outstanding natural beauty. In fact, our candidate was proposing even stronger protections, and at no time during this process have we said that we wanted to start interfering with Greenbelt or areas of outstanding natural beauty, for example. This is all about trying to deliver housing for our children and our grandchildren in an affordable way, and I think every family in the country wants to see their loved ones being able to get on the housing ladder. You know, home ownership is an important part of who we are. It's a core tenet of what certainly we believe as Conservatives. And whilst it's been good to see an encouraging rise in home ownership and a build last year which is the highest in about 35 years, we've got more to do and choices to make. And I don't think we can shy away from that.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying about what you want to do, but as you say, you've got choices to make. And one choice that you have to make is whether you will take away the right to have a second line of objection to development. Now, in the white paper, you said you would. Will you stick to that or not? Well,
as I've said, the white paper is the first stage in policy development. The detailed legislation is yet to follow. What I can say is that in those proposals, there are plenty of opportunities for local communities to have their say and to make their voices heard. And the idea that somehow local communities are going to be disregarded or ignored is just not the case. It's a mischaracterisation of the proposals. It's all about getting that agreement before development even begins. You know, for too often, Trevor, this has been a war between objectors and developers. We've got to change the way we do planning in this country, and I think it's right for our party to be bold and come up with new ideas.
So you're clear that that original proposal is not set in stone, could change?
Well, look, what I'm saying is that the principles that we've set out, which is our planning system is now nearly 80 years old, and clearly in many respects is not working well and not delivering fairness to many residents. I think all of us can speak with experience of that. Something must be done in order to change that, get the balance right, but also deliver the homes that our country needs.
Developments this morning. Just how sad are you to see John Bercow leaving your party?
Well, I think to be fair to John Bercow, I think he left the Conservative Party a long time ago. I mean, he's a private citizen. He's entitled to make decisions about his politics, and I respect that. What I would say is that I think as a former Speaker, he's somebody who, even though he's left office, does carry a degree of authority like his predecessors. And I think that his predecessors' authority was enhanced by their refusal to go back into party politics. It certainly didn't stop them speaking out. I mean, Baroness Boothroyd is very forthright in the House of Lords, for example, and speaks out on things that she believes passionately in. It certainly doesn't stop them doing that, and I wouldn't want to see that. But I think him joining a political party actually has the effect of diminishing the force of his voice in politics, however strong he wants it to be.
Let me understand that. You actually didn't give John Bercow the opportunity to go back into the House of Lords and make that sort of intervention. But are you saying that you think what he has said today, Conservative Party, xenophobic, nationalistic, do you think he's diminishing his office?
Well, look, first of all, I disagree totally with his characterisation. He's got every right to say that. He's a private citizen and he's made a choice. But he is a former Speaker of the House of Commons. And I do think that when people get elected to that very high office, they put party politics behind them. And I actually think that his voice would have been stronger had he stayed out of party politics, being free to express his views on all sorts of things in the eloquent way he always does. But getting back into party politics is something that no previous Speaker has done. And I would gently suggest that perhaps his voice would have been strengthened if he'd not made that choice that he's announced overnight.
Let's go on to your own bailiwick, as it were. It's reported this morning that you're considering intervening in the Colin Pitchfork case. Colin Pitchfork, who murdered 2 teenagers and is now thought to be released under the parole board jurisdiction. Are you planning to intervene to stop that happening?
Well, the decision was made by the parole board in early June. I have 21 days to consider whether or not I ask them for a formal reconsideration. I'm working my way through that very carefully. I'm taking advice on the matter, and I'll make an announcement within that 21-day period as soon as possible.
This week you said that you were ashamed of the government's record on rape convictions. 55,000 thereabouts recorded by the police, of which only about 2,000 were prosecuted, just under 1,500 convictions. That is pretty shameful. But besides wringing your hands about it, what are you actually going to do about it?
Well, the rape review contains an action plan that is designed to, first of all, get us back to the level of prosecutions that we saw about 5 years ago. And the way we're going to do that is by making sure that prosecution and police are working very closely together in order to prepare the best possible evidence, to make sure that cases are prepared as thoroughly as possible, and that there's a real focus on the alleged perpetrators. Very often victims will say, it does seem to be all about me. Everybody's focusing upon me and my private life, whilst disclosure and the importance of fairness clearly is at the heart of a criminal trial process. We do need to shift that focus, and that's what these proposals commit to, and indeed with further support that I'm providing with regard to independent sexual advisors, sexual abuse advisors, we are working our way towards, I hope, a return at least to those levels, and frankly we need to go further in order to increase confidence.
Justice Secretary, that's fair answer, but it's what everybody else is going to do rather than what you are going to do. Now, your Labour shadow has said that if you can't get the numbers down, into a respectable place, the 2016 target that you've just mentioned, for example, in a year's time, you should resign. Are you going to take up his challenge?
Well, first of all, I think that the nature of that challenge and the low politics of it speaks volumes for the complete failure by the Labour Party to actually come up with anything constructive on this most serious of issues. I mean, it's also constitutionally illiterate. Decisions made to investigate and prosecute are made by the independent police and their operational work and the CPS, which is independent. If there was any suggestion that prosecutions were being brought about because of political pressure on me, frankly, that would make convictions unsafe. It's a ridiculous argument, and it frankly demeans the debate.
Justice Secretary, but that's all about everybody else. I'm asking you about you. Is, number one, is a target too low? Are you thinking it's the wrong target? And what will you do? Will you promise to resign if you don't manage to make whichever target you set?
Look, as I've said, the idea that somehow a resignation or political pressure should be brought to bear on independent prosecutorial decisions is not only bad politics, it's actually dangerous. And I'm not going to indulge in that level of debate, Trevor. I'm trying to talk about the serious issues. I've rightly acknowledged the position we're in. I've never sort of hedged from it. No ifs, no buts. It's not the position I want to be in. But the other agencies who are responsible for this have now got a clear lead. We've all agreed this document. We now need to get on with implementing it. And that's what I'm going to help focus on together with the independent agencies.
OK, I don't want to be flippant. I know that this is a serious programme and so on, but can I just ask you this? Just how useless is Matt Hancock?
Well, I don't think he's useless at all. In fact, I've known him for many years and I've seen him step up to the plate throughout this crisis, working tirelessly on our behalf to make sure that the response to COVID, the health service response, the health response was as vigorous as possible. It's been a huge challenge for him, a huge challenge for all of us. But to bandy around words like that, I think, does nobody any service at all. He's been a most useful and dynamic health secretary who enjoys our full support.
I just want to be absolutely clear about this because I think you're treading on dangerous ground here because those are the Prime Minister's words and it appears to me you're disagreeing with your boss.
Well, you know, I'm not going to get into text messages or WhatsApp messages sent between people and then disclosed in a rather unfortunate way, shall we say. I don't believe that that's actually a reflection of the reality. I've been working within Cabinet, within government throughout this crisis, and I don't detect any suggestion that somehow there is anything but the fullest confidence in what Matt has been doing and what he continues to do so energetically.
Robert Buckland, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Trevor.
Now, British politics has involved its fair share of weirdness in the last few years, but eyebrows were still raised this week when this happened. Yes, that was Sir Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader, knocking down a fake blue wall after his party overturned a big Conservative majority to win the Chesham and Amersham by-election. Mr Davey says the Lib Dems are on the march and gunning for other seats in the so-called Tory blue wall. But how realistic is that ambition? Let's ask Ed Davey. He joins us now. Sir Ed, stunning result in Chesham and Amersham, 25% swing. In the famous words of one of your predecessors, are you preparing for government yet?
Look, this is a huge moment for the Liberal Democrats. It's a big moment in British politics and for the British people. I think up till we defeated the Conservatives in Chesham and Amersham, people thought Boris Johnson couldn't be beaten, that he was somehow impregnable. Now they know he can. The Liberal Democrats showed that Boris Johnson could be beaten. And I've noticed how people are smiling more today. I think there's a glimmer of hope that the Conservatives can be beaten. The Liberal Democrats are going to do that in any safe Conservative seat, particularly on the blue wall seats. We are gunning for them, that's right.
I love the idea that the whole country is smiling at this victory just in time for the summer solstice. But seriously, we didn't see anything as big as or dramatic as this swing in the elections last month. So presumably you must accept that there are local factors, HS2, the planning issue, that really contributed to this size of swing.
Well, there are always some local factors, but actually on the doorsteps, and I went to Chesham and Amersham 16 times, I talked to hundreds of people, and the feeling I got from them was they'd been taken for granted by the Conservatives. Many people on the doorstep said I was the first politician to knock on their doors, and they'd lived there for 20, 30 years. So people, not just in Chesham and Amersham, but across the Blue Wall seats, I think have been taken for granted, and they saw Liberal Democrats listening to them, responding to them. And one of the things I heard was they felt that Boris Johnson wasn't in tune with traditional Conservative values, and they were worried about a whole range of national issues as well. So, I'm confident that we are seeing a change in British politics, much bigger than people had been seeing. I think that both the pandemic and the polls have not picked this up. And there can be big shifts in British politics. We saw it in Scotland when the Labour monopoly went. We've seen it in the north of England with the Conservatives on the march. I think the blue wall in the south can be taken by the Liberal Democrats in large numbers of constituencies.
Let's see if those high expectations, which frankly we've heard before, can actually be fulfilled. And you talk about talking to people on the doorstep. What will the Liberal Democrats leaflet at a general election say? Will they say, as your candidate did in Chesham and Amersham, we are totally opposed to HS2? Or will they say, as you have said in the House of Commons, we support HS2 as an essential aspect of development of this country?
Well, if you remember, Cheryl Gillen, who sadly died and triggered this by-election, she opposed HS2 on behalf of her constituents in Chesham and Amersham. She fought boldly against her own party, the Conservative Party, who railroaded it through. I think it's completely reasonable for Sarah Green, wanting to be the representative for Chesham and Amersham, to have an independent voice. But let's be clear, Trevor, Liberal Democrats are in favour and will remain in favour of high-speed links, because it's important to get more capacity on our railways. It's important to invest in public transport for climate change. But that doesn't mean we have to accept the way the government are implementing HS2, the way the HS2 company is going about things, because they're not listening to people in Chesham and Amersham. They're not. We felt on the doorsteps again that they were being taken for granted by the Department for Transport and by the HS2 company.
Ed Davey, though, I mean, it's not like you've got hundreds of MPs. You haven't got that many to have different factions within. Where will you stand when you come to a national contest? Are you, as a party, going to be for HS2, or are you not going to be for HS2?
Well, interesting, Trevor. The HS2 legislation has passed Parliament. It's impossible to have another vote on it, certainly in the next few years. What is before Parliament is a planning bill. And both with HS2 and the planning bill and many other things, the Conservatives have been taking people for granted, haven't been listening. Okay. And the planning bill and the proposed planning reforms, which are, frankly, a developer's charter, were what the vast majority of people were concerned about in Chesham and Amersham. Okay. They're worried that, and on yet another environmental issue, the government is saying one thing and doing another, not listening to local people.
OK, let's clear up something that seems to have emerged in the last couple of days. Liberal Democrat path to government, as your predecessor Nick Clegg showed, probably lies through some kind of alliance or arrangement or understanding with a larger party. You could reach an understanding with Labour, not a formal pact, that you don't contest seats where one of you can't win. Are you up for that?
Well, I thought what was interesting, Chesham and Amersham, lots of Labour and Green voters saw Liberal Democrats not only just the best party to beat the Conservatives, but also liked our policies. And therefore, I think we shouldn't take voters for granted, should we? I don't think political parties own their voters and can't tell them which way to go. I'm interested in arguing for progressive policies that are in tune with people in Britain, and I'm determined to make sure that we win in those areas where we really are competitive, and we showed how competitive we are in Chesham and Amersham, and actually in the local elections before that, just last month. And we took control of Oxfordshire and Cambridgeshire councils for the first time. We made big gains in Hertfordshire and Surrey and Wiltshire. This, I think, gives credence to this argument about the blue wall, that the Liberal Democrats can make advances against the Conservatives in that. And I think it would just be wrong, Trevor, to be honest, to say that people can't have a chance to vote for a Liberal Democrat candidate, or indeed a chance to vote for a Labour candidate.
Yeah, but we know what this is real politics, and I'm detecting the sense that you're not going to be tremendously upset if you as a party decide that you're going to concentrate your efforts in areas where you can win and where the Labour Party is more likely to beat the Tories than you are, that you might decide that you're not going to throw all your eggs into those particular baskets. This is not formal, but are we saying that we are in that kind of territory?
Trevor, I think the audience to this programme will be surprised to hear you say that it's somehow unusual for parties to go after areas where they can win. We don't have a huge amount of resources.
No, but you don't
we need
not
to allocate
fight
those
areas
resources.
where you can't win.
I'm saying that the Liberal Democrats, under my leadership, will be a campaigning party. We will go out there and campaign for every vote, but we'll use our resources wisely. The first past the post system, it's dreadful. We want proportional representation. We want electoral reform. But until we get that, we've got to play with the current system. And that requires you to concentrate your resources in areas where you're well placed to beat the incumbent. And that's, for the Liberal Democrats, that's almost entirely beating Conservatives.
Sir Ed Davey, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, this morning, John Bercow, the former House of Commons Speaker, has defected to the Labour Party. A Conservative since his youth, he served as a Conservative MP from 1997 until 2009, before occupying the Speaker's chair for a decade. Government sources have told Sky News they're not surprised by the defection, after bitter rows over Brexit made him many enemies in his former party. Well, for his first TV interview about the decision, I'm joined here in the studio by John Bercow.
Trevor, good morning to you.
Good morning. 25 years, it's a long time. Why leave now after all that time?
Well, I was a member of the Conservative Party for 29 years, but Robert Buckland spoke truer than he knew when he said that I left the Conservative Party a long time ago. Let's be crystal clear, explicit and accurate, Trevor. I became Speaker on the 22nd of June 2009, and that evening, in conformity with convention, I wrote to the then chairman of the Conservative Party, Eric Pickles, to tender my resignation as a member of the Conservative Party. Why? Because the Speaker does not belong to, is independent of, separate from, unconnected with, expressing no support for or opposition to any political party.
That's a different decision. You could have rejoined when you stepped down as Speaker 18 months ago. Why didn't you?
I could have rejoined the Conservative Party. I didn't have the slightest desire to do so, and I want to be fundamentally clear and for there to be no dubiety about this. As I said yesterday to an Observer journalist, my values are left of centre. I do not identify with the Conservative Party. And I think that in British politics, you've just heard from Ed Davey, most people still see it as principally a choice between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. And the Labour Party is the alternative government to the Conservative Party. If you believe, as I do, that this government is bad news, unfit to govern, and that the Prime Minister, though a successful campaigner, is a lousy governor, you have to ask yourself, do you want rid of it? And if you want rid of it, you have then to pose to yourself the question and to answer it, how is that to be achieved? And the reality of the matter is that in the United Kingdom, the only credible vehicle for the removal of this government is the election of a Labour government committed to equality, social justice, internationalism and a fairer and more inclusive society. That's the Labour brand.
I know you're a person who chooses your words very carefully, John. You've used the expression this government, I think 3 or 4 times this morning. At what point did you decide you couldn't be a Conservative? Was it when the Conservative Party was taken over by Boris Johnson, or was it something that changed in you?
No, it was something that changed in me. And I think...
Oh, so it's not Boris Johnson.
I owe it to myself and to you and to everybody else to be on the record about it and for there to be no uncertainty. So if you're saying to me, is it principally about Boris Johnson? The honest answer to that is no. And in fact, there has been, I think, already some confusion and misrepresentation of that point. It's not personal against Boris Johnson. I do think that he is someone who has only a nodding acquaintance with the truth in a leap year, and I think that the utter contempt with which he has treated Parliament is lamentable, and I think it has exacerbated the very strong feelings of resentment towards him, because I think a lot of people feel that's not the way to behave. Telling the truth in and to Parliament matters. Circumventing Parliament is wrong. Treating Parliament with disdain is objectionable. But no, I have over a long period evolved my political thinking. I wasn't a member of a party throughout my 10-year tenure as Speaker because it would have been quite wrong to be. I didn't take a view. I sought to facilitate the House of Commons to express its view and all individual members to put their points across, because that's the responsibility of the Speaker. Now I'm a private citizen, as Robert Buckland says. I'm entitled to take a political view, and my view is a left-of-centre view. I identify with Labour values, Labour principles, Labour policies.
I'm going to come to Labour in a second, but you've used the words xenophobic, nationalistic. You have just said some, let's say, less than fond things about Boris Johnson. It's the party you don't like, isn't it? And you don't like Conservatives anymore.
Well, I don't dislike individual Conservatives. I have still a number of Conservative friends, and I can admire and respect very much, Trevor, people across the political spectrum with a vast miscellany of different views on the understanding that they're honest and principled and standing up for the principles in which they believe. So it's not a question of personalities, it's a question of the issues. But if you say, do I like the Conservative Party, the answer is no. And I'm absolutely clear that I am not, these days, a Conservative. So it's not about Boris Johnson. As Tony Benn used to say, it's not about personalities, it's about policies.
All right. You know what they're saying, aren't they? Boris Johnson didn't give you a peerage, and Keir Starmer will.
No.
Give that up.
Well, I can answer that very simply. I've had absolutely no discussion whatsoever, either with Keir Starmer or any other member of the Labour leadership about that matter. There has been no barter, no trade, no deal whatsoever. And if I may very politely say so, and I do, the people who make what they think is that potent and coruscating criticism of me are operating according to their own rather low standards. Let's deal with the issue rather than impugn people's motives. It's got nothing to do with that whatsoever.
Right. Before we leave that, Leader of the Opposition conceivably might be watching this programme. It might be occurring to him right now, I must bring up John and offer him a peerage. If he were to do that, what would you say?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said, Trevor, for the old Willie Whitelaw adage. Personally, I think it is best to cross bridges only when one comes to them. It isn't in my mind. It's not part of the game plan. I haven't discussed it. I'm not waiting for it. What I'm motivated by is a commitment to equality, social justice and internationalism, and I believe absolutely passionately. And these are the issues that, on levelling up, the government mouths the mantra, but it doesn't know the meaning of the mantra. If you look at the recent record, the government's own education czar said £15,000 million is needed to level up, and the government has offered less than 1/10 of that. Let's focus on the issues. Slashing the aid budget, it's wrong. It's objectionable. It's utterly shameful.
We talk about these things a lot on this programme, but, you know, we have the excitement of having you here this morning. So let's talk about you.
With pleasure.
It could be said that this is a typical Bercow grand gesture to avoid speculation as part of your legacy of the criticism of you as presiding over a culture of bullying in the Houses of Parliament. How do you respond to that? That this is not really what you're about. What you're really trying to do is to bury all of that.
I'm not trying to bury anything. I think the suggestion that I presided over that culture is quite wrong. I'm not going to talk about individual instances because there is a confidentiality about that process which shouldn't be compromised or disrespected in any way. I can just say, however, there was one individual who brought a complaint of bullying against me. It was investigated and it was rejected. But I put to you again, Trevor, and I appreciate you've got your journalistic responsibility. Let's focus on the issues.
No,
and as far as I'm concerned, the issues are what caused me to make the decision I've made.
Last point. Speak honestly to me.
I always do.
Can you say that you never did anything that you felt now you regret, or you thought might have been objectionable, or that might have been something that, when you look back now, you think, I wish I hadn't done that?
Oh, good heavens.
In relation to this issue of bullying and so on.
Gosh, I would have to cast my mind back. We all make mistakes. Have I been perfect in every instance? Can I say that, with the benefit of hindsight, I'd never have done something differently? Of course I couldn't. But I come back to the central proposition. One has, as a private citizen, the right to make a judgment about which political party to support. I believe, in terms of values, the Labour Party is preferable to the Conservative Party. And as far as Keir Starmer is concerned, I don't know whether he's going to make it politically or not, but I think he's an honest, decent, intelligent person who has come into politics as the continuation of public service. And the real issue, in my mind, is who has the vision of a more equitable society? Who thirsts to deliver social mobility? Who wants to better the lot of people less fortunate than a political leader? On that calculus, Keir Starmer is vastly preferable to Boris Johnson.
You've talked about Labour's values and policies. I have to confess, I've been doing this programme for some weeks now. I've yet to drag anything that looked like a policy out of a Labour spokesperson. What is a policy or value that you think Labour has that really offers this vision?
I'll give you two examples. One domestic and one international. A domestic commitment to levelling up and the proper funding of education so that those who have been dramatically damaged as a consequence of the pandemic have the chance to recover. That's the first example. And the second example, which speaks to the DNA of a progressive party, is that the Labour Party thinks it is utterly wrong and immoral to slash the aid budget, cutting provision for the poorest and most destitute people on the face of the planet who don't live on $1 a day. They exist on $1 a day. That is wrong. Period.
I'm afraid I have to ask pretty much everybody who has experienced government and been seen in the Conservative Party this today. Matt Hancock, completely useless or what?
Well, I think it would be fair for me to say that I would buy Matt at my valuation and sell him at his and realise a healthy profit in the process.
I think I've worked out exactly what that means. Well, we'll see how Hancock's fare. Thank you very much, John Bercow.
Trevor, thank you very much indeed. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Now, we hear a lot about levelling up, and John Bercow's just been talking about that. It's been one of the Prime Minister's key rallying calls in the last 2 years. But if the phrase is to mean anything, it will have to be about more than just infrastructure. It's also about skills, jobs, education. And many teachers, parents and students don't feel that the government's putting its money where its mouth is, after just £1.5 billion was earmarked recently for post-pandemic catch-up learning. So some areas have taken matters into their own hands. This week, we went to South Yorkshire to investigate. Penistone Grammar School in South Yorkshire is one of the oldest in the country. Founded in the 14th century, today this secondary school has a reputation for excellence.
When I turned up this morning to attend this event...
Intensely proud of its history, the school holds a regular remembrance service for the many former pupils who lost their lives serving their country. But in the past 16 months, the head teacher has been battling a host of other problems.
The first challenge, obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions around students and adults, both teaching and associate staff, coming onto school site. First and foremost, it's been around students' mental health. We've had a real focus on supporting students around mental health, their pastoral well-being, also their attendance to online learning and also to attendance coming back into school.
Some of you might watch today and you might decide that you want to improve your speeches for next week. That's absolutely fine. You can
like children across the country, the pupils of Penistone have struggled throughout lockdown.
Just staying at home and not being able to see anyone, especially teachers, it was so much more difficult to concentrate at home because there's so many more distractions, and at school you can get your head down more and just concentrate on the work, but at home it's a lot more difficult.
The government approach to catch-up funding has come under fire in recent weeks for being inadequate. Now local leaders here in Barnsley say they're tired of waiting and are getting their own chequebooks out. To help their pupils, the school, with the backing of a local university, devised a mentoring scheme in which children received one-to-one coaching.
Hello.
Are you alright?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good. It's nice to see you in person.
This recent graduate spent 6 weeks tutoring and helping Alison in the run-up to her exams, and today is the first time they've met face-to-face.
I had a selection of students from schools within South Yorkshire. It was a 6-week programme where we covered a variety of activities and workbooks, so roughly about 12 workbooks over the programme. And we spoke about anything to do with skills, future development, future planning, careers, exam and strategic sort of learning, calming strategies, that kind of thing.
It did help me a lot improve my own confidence in myself. So to believe in myself that I can do it, that I can do my work, and just to try as hard as possible. So with that confidence in myself, it gave me motivation as well to carry on with my work and get the grades that I wanted to achieve.
The mentoring scheme was devised here by members of the Education Department at Hallam University. They worked with local schools to allocate resources where they were needed most, with funding from local government.
What's been really crucial to the success of this is that we've co-designed it with our schools. You know, we didn't say this is what you need to do. They said, actually, you know, we've got subject specialists in our schools, so actually that's okay for us. What we need is this more nuanced mentoring programme.
Boris Johnson repeatedly tells us he's aiming to level up. What he means is targeting voters in traditional red wall seats.
Are you pleased to be back at school? Yes.
He claims that one of the government's priorities is education, dealing not just with the immediate COVID crisis, but also in the long term. But critics, including those that run the mentoring scheme in South Yorkshire, say he's failing to deliver.
I don't think it's enough. I mean, I'll always say there's never enough money goes into education. You know, if we want to thrive as a nation, then obviously, you know, we need to invest in our young people, and the earlier we invest in our young people, the better. So I'll always say there's never enough. I also think there's been what the pandemic has done has exaggerated the gap in terms of the north and the south in terms of where money is allocated. You know, we know from the data that schools in the north have been more affected in terms of lockdowns and isolations and disadvantage in terms of equipment being available, etc. So unfortunately what the pandemic has done is really highlighted that. So there's a real need for the money to go where it's needed rather than you know, a scattergun approach that will suit everyone.
The claim that there's not enough cash is echoed here at the town hall. Part of the funding to help the children at local schools came from an already squeezed council budget, and even funds the regional mayor had set aside to run his own office.
It is extraordinary that I'm having to use money that has been dedicated for something else in order to make sure that our kids get a decent educational opportunity, given everything that's gone on. But that is the nature of the funding arrangements that we find ourselves in, and that's why I think it's really important that the government do go much further and provide much greater levels of investment, so those kids who have been disadvantaged as a result of lockdown get every opportunity to catch up.
And the mayor believes that all this is symptomatic of a much wider problem at the heart of the government strategy.
If the government really want to empower the north and not the huge potential that exists here, they will work closely with me and others and make sure that we've got the tools to do the job. We want to work with the government, we really do, but at the moment we haven't yet seen the levels of investment that we need to make a meaningful difference.
There's no doubt that the Conservatives are now appealing to millions of former Labour voters who share a vision of traditional values such as hard work and patriotism. But if the readies and the resources don't follow the rhetoric, then the electoral gains of 2019 may well be remembered as little more than a missed opportunity. Our piece from South Yorkshire there. In response to that, a Department for Education spokesperson told us, as part of our ambitious and long-term education recovery plan, we're investing over £1.5 billion for tutoring in schools and colleges, with over £500 million going directly to schools and £1 billion invested through the National Tutoring Programme. We're also giving over £900 million to schools, which can be used flexibly to support pupils in the way that works best for them. Sticking to that theme of education, data released today by the Social Mobility Foundation finds that disadvantaged young people have little faith in the education system. A survey of over 1,500 high-achieving but disadvantaged young people, the majority of them on free school meals, found that 38% are not confident that they will receive fair grades reflective of their ability from the system of teacher assessment in place this summer. Over half, 52%, are not confident that they will be able to appeal grades that they think are not a fair reflection of their ability. And on the theme of levelling up, 58% of participants felt that not all parts of the country had suffered equally because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, to discuss this further, we're joined by the chair of the Social Mobility Foundation and former Labour Cabinet Minister, Alan Milburn. We were talking earlier about all of this, Alan. You've got some new data, this new data out today. What do you think this really tells us about the faith that young people have in the system?
Well, I think the faith is pretty low, self-evident from the survey that you just reported, Trevor. I think the real issue, immediate issue here, is the fact that the means by which assessment for GCSEs this year is going to take place isn't really taking account of the disproportionate effect that the pandemic has had on the poorest kids. You know, they're the ones who are least likely to have a laptop. 40% of them don't have reliable broadband. Often they don't even have a quiet place to study at home. So all of that should really have been taken into account in the way that schools go about assessing pupils for the GCSEs. And it also should be taken into account in the appeals process if a kid wants to appeal against the results that they've been given. That isn't happening. It should be happening. It needs to change, because otherwise what we'll have is this ever-widening gap between the educational attainment of poor kids and their better-off peers. And if that happens, then you've got yet another hammer blow against social mobility in the country. And I don't think that's what the country wants to achieve. I hope that it isn't what the government wants to achieve. So it really needs to look at the assessment process and the appeals process again.
The thing that struck me most forcibly is that so many thought that different parts of the country had suffered differently from COVID when it comes to education. What's behind that?
Well, I think it represents what you might call the new geography of disadvantage in the country. There are parts of the country that are doing really well, and there are parts of the country that are falling behind. So Boris Johnson is quite right, in my view, to set this levelling up agenda in motion. The problem is that levelling up at the moment is a political slogan, but what it isn't is a real policy. Now, I hope that the Prime Minister's appointment of Neil O'Brien, the Conservative MP, to put some flesh on the bones of levelling up will make a real difference. But let's be clear about it. If you're going to tackle these issues, it's going to require some fundamental reforms. It's going to be a long, hard journey. It's not just about building a few new roads or relocating a few jobs from Whitehall. You'll need reform in the education system, in the labour market. For example, we know that the difference a really good teacher makes to a poor child's education is about an extra year of learning. What we ought to be doing, in my view, and the government ought to take this seriously, is find new ways to pay the best teachers to go and work in the most challenging schools. Because if you do that, then there is a chance of levelling up actually happening. You're not going to get levelling up unless you have a level playing field of educational opportunity.
Government, Labour governments including, and unions have always resisted the idea that there should be, if you like, different rates of pay, or that there should be government direction, as there is in France, where teachers are located. Are you saying that we need to essentially embark on reforms of that scale? Yes,
I think there should be a reform of national pay bargaining. You know, it's no good paying the good teacher the same amount to go and work in the wealthy suburb school as to go and work in a disadvantaged area, because the challenges are obviously far greater going and working in a disadvantaged school. And this is the real crux of the issue, isn't it? There's a debate about, is it that somehow or other ability isn't evenly distributed in our society, or is it opportunity? Well, I believe it's firmly the latter. You can't have a situation where a disadvantaged kid from a poor area is over 20 times more likely to go to an inadequate school than someone from a wealthy area and believe that that's a level playing field. It simply isn't. So if you're going to make levelling up work, there has to be a redistribution, both of resources, of people, in this case teachers, and of opportunities. It's not just about Mr. Johnson's obsession with capital projects, important though they are, roads and railways and bridges and green projects or free ports. It's about how you make sure that opportunities in education, in the labour market, are there for people. So that if people living in one of these areas want to move up in society, they don't feel that they've got to move out of their area.
When it comes to moving up in society, I was very struck by some data that the Social Mobility Foundation that you chair released a couple of weeks ago, which showed that 72% of the young people that you work with think that a young person's future depends on what their parents did or do, and that increasingly they decide, well, we're not going to bother to try in certain areas, because we know we're not going to make it because our families aren't from there. That's pretty depressing, isn't it?
Yes, it's pretty depressing, but unfortunately it's real. We know that we have a social mobility crisis in this country. We've had it for very many years. Things are getting worse, not better. You don't need me to recite all the data, but just hold on to one fact. Today, only 1 in 8 children from a low-income background is likely to become a high-income earner as an adult. And it's unsurprising, really, that parents and grandparents are worrying that the prospects that we've all had in our lives to get on and move up in society are not going to be available to the COVID generation. We had, 1 million young people who are unemployed. Half of the under 25s were either furloughed or had lost their jobs by June last year. That is a real problem. And frankly, right now, neither the Conservative Party nor the Labour Party are taking this issue of social mobility as seriously as they should be. And they really need to do that. If you're going to have a fair society and a stronger society, then we've got to make sure that generational equality, and not just racial equality or gender equality or class equality, are on the agenda, and they need to be far higher, in my view.
And we've got a few seconds left, and I can't have you, a former health secretary who really made big efforts at reform, go without asking you what you think COVID has revealed about the capacity of government, the machine, to cope with this kind of issue, or indeed the general task.
Well, look, it's obviously been an immensely challenging situation, quite unprecedented, and obviously it's involved difficult judgments having to be made continually. Some judgments have been got right, so the NHS vaccine rollout programme is genuinely world-leading. Some failures are pretty obvious on PPE, for example, test and trace, and also the catastrophe really unleashed on the care home sector, which has been a tragedy both for staff and for residents. So I think the real lesson here is one of preparedness. We weren't prepared for the pandemic. This will not be the last pandemic that the world faces, Trevor. We will need to be better prepared for the next one. That means that supply chains and equipment and pharmaceuticals and drugs all need to be available. It also means that we need some fundamental reform of the institutions that have been undermined as a consequence of COVID, and most notably the social care sector. Successive governments have talked about that. Mr. Johnson is still talking about it. It needs radical reform and not just more money. Of course, there'll be more money that will be needed, but that is going to have to come not just from the taxpayer, it's going to have to come from us as individuals. And frankly, we're going to have to save for our old age, and that will probably have to be done through compulsory means rather than voluntary. That won't always be popular, but if we're going to avoid the sort of situation that we've seen in our care homes this time round, if it ever happens again next time, then those are the sort of measures that are going to have to be grappled with.
We'll no doubt talk about this again, Alan. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Trevor.
We've talked earlier today about Chesham and Amersham. It was never a race that Labour expected to win, but they still had a pretty shocking night, losing their deposit. Let's talk about that result and more with Shadow Community Secretary Steve Reid. Steve Reid, the constituency Labour Party in Chesham and Amersham has 629 followers on its Facebook page. Your candidate got 622 votes. What happened to the other 7?
Well, let's give voters some credit here, Trevor, because what I think happened is that voters took their own decisions about the best way to defeat the Conservative candidate in that by-election. So Labour voters lent their support to the Liberal Democrat who was best positioned. That's never been a seat where Labour's been competitive. It's never been a seat where Labour's done particularly well. And, you know, voters took their own decisions and they defeated Boris Johnson. And they defeated him for very good reasons as well.
But it's pretty grim, isn't it? I mean, this is a seat, 55% Remain, 40%, I think, graduates. It's a sort of place that Labour should be doing well and needs to do well if it's going to compete for government again. Isn't it worrying that you can't compete in this area?
If you look across what happened in the local elections in the south of England just a few weeks ago, Labour won the mayoralty of the west of England. We picked up seats in Hertfordshire, we picked up seats in Sussex, we were increasing our vote in Kent. Labour is doing well across the blue wall. In this particular seat, it was the Liberal Democrats who were competitive. Now, in a general election, there will be only 2 alternatives for Prime Minister, Boris Johnson or Keir Starmer. So things may look differently then. As things were on Thursday, the Liberal Democrats were best placed to defeat the Conservatives, and Labour voters backed the Lib Dem in order to get the Tory out. And one of the reasons for that was the hugely unpopular planning reforms that the government is bringing forward to deprive local people of any say over developments on their own streets and in their own neighbourhood. So, you know, there is a growing coalition across this country intent on stopping the Conservatives from continuing on the path they're going along about this country's future.
I want to come to the planning issue because that's an area that I know you are expert in. But let's just talk about the politics of this for another minute or so. Did I understand from what you've just said that, however informal, however unspoken, you think that the possibility of essentially an anti-Tory alliance exists that would see the different parties, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, the Scottish National Party, essentially combining to get the Tories out?
Well, I didn't mean to imply that at all, Trevor. I'm not myself attracted. You're talking fundamentally about what's called the Progressive Alliance, so-called, and I'm not attracted at all to the idea of politicians trying to stitch up the choices available to voters in their own localities. Voters are smart. Voters will take their own decision, and in Chesham and Amersham, they took the decision they took, and in the west of England they took a different decision. The key for Labour is to win a majority across the country. The blue wall is clearly crumbling now, but we saw in Hartlepool the Labour Party is having problems still in some parts of former industrial areas in different parts of the country. We need to build out now a policy and a programme that has broad reach across the whole of the country to secure the election of a Labour majority government. That is what we are focused on, not stitching up deals with other parties to deprive voters of choice.
So for you, it's a Labour majority or nothing. No alliances with the SNP, no understandings with the Liberal Democrats.
Well, this is, it's in the hands of the voters rather than me how they choose to vote. But what Keir is doing at the moment, and we've seen the changes he's started to bring in over the last few weeks, is gearing the Labour Party up to the next general election. He's appointed Annalisa Dodds to head up a policy review. Our intention is to build a policy platform attractive enough to win support from across the country for a majority Labour government that can bring our party back together after a decade in which the Conservatives have pulled our country apart and made us weaker, both domestically and on the world stage.
Well, let's address policy. You said that the planning issue was a major question in Chesham and Amersham. Will Labour support the government's plans to streamline the planning system and to make it easier to build homes and harder for people to object to new developments?
Well, as I'm sure you're aware, we've called a vote in the Commons tomorrow on some of what's going on here. And what the Conservatives are up to is they've got a flagship piece of legislation that they're bringing forward as part of their new legislative programme. And what it does, it takes away the rights of local people and local communities to object to developments that may be happening in their localities. Power is shifted from elected councils and their planning committees to development boards that are appointed by Conservative ministers in Whitehall. Those development boards then zone your locality either for protection or for growth. If you're zoned for growth, then planning applications are deemed accepted, and even if you're going to see a development on a green space like the one I'm standing on now or on the street where you live, you as a resident lose the right to have a say and to object to that application. This is a significant reduction in people's rights, and the reason the Conservatives are doing this is because under Boris Johnson's leadership, donations to the Conservative Party from major developers have gone up by 400%. So the Conservatives are paying back developers by selling out communities and depriving communities of the right to a say over developments on their own street. Now, we're calling a vote tomorrow in the House of Commons to guarantee the right of residents to object. And those Conservative MPs who have stood up in the chamber so far and said they don't like this, well, put your money where your mouth is, because there's a vote tomorrow and you can vote with us to protect residents' rights.
Isn't the outcome of all of that that essentially Labour is lining up with the NIMBYs who say we don't want new development in our backyard, even if that means that young people who want to buy homes, there will be no homes available for them? Isn't that the outcome of what you've just said?
There's 2 points here, Trevor, and I've got experience of this myself. I used to chair a regeneration board that brought forward 5,000 new homes. The best development happens when developers, local councils and communities work together. It doesn't work well when all the power is in the hands of the developers and everybody else is silenced from having a say. But if you want to look at what the real problem is in this country that is stopping homes being built, it's not the planning system that the government is trying to change. Because over the last 10 years, 1 million homes have been given consent to be built but were never built. The problem isn't the planning system, the problem is developers not then going ahead and building them. And the reason some developers do that is land that has a planning consent on it becomes more valuable, and some developers will sit on that land, wait for the land values to rise and then seek to make a profit by selling it on without building the homes. What we need are better incentives to help developers go ahead and build the homes once they've got consent, not putting a gag around local people's mouths so they can't have a say about what happens on the street where they live or the community that they're part of.
Steve Reed, thank you for your clarity this morning.
Pleasure.
That's it for the main show today. Don't go anywhere, though. After the break, we'll be joined by our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, for Trevor Phillips' The Take. We'll be going over everything we learned from our guests, discussing what it means, and looking forward to next week. That's straight after this short break.